Welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen Andrews. And today, this video is inspired by another video by another Booktuber. And that video in turn was apparently partially inspired by a video I made and put up about a week ago, which did ruffle a few feathers. And it was about the terminology around science fiction and SF, what the naming of the genre is. And, you know, it did ruffle a few feathers. Some people weren't very happy. And, you know, no sort of personal offence was meant to anybody. So maybe I should have tempered it a bit. But I do stand by what I said. And I just want to sort of talk about that a little bit. But this other YouTuber, my illustrious friend, I guess you could say if we were in a legal case, he talked about gatekeeping and why gatekeeping was a bad thing. And I've heard the phrase before, and it's quite an interesting topic, actually. And I looked at some other videos, and, you know, there's quite a lot of them on YouTube about it. And, you know, I guess it's something I had thought about, but it did make me think about it in depth. So that's a good thing because, you know, it's all about the dialogue and the debate. So really what I want to talk about were some things that he said about my views on gatekeeping, whether it's good or bad, what it is. I want to talk briefly about the history of fandom with specific reference to science fiction, and his thoughts that gatekeeping could lead to the stagnation of genres. So I've got some interesting things about that as well. And it ties in with other broader things on the channel. So this could really have gone on and on and on. I made some notes on this because there's a lot of complex arguments. And I've realised that once I start making notes, that's it. I got nearly 4,000 words. So this may take a while, but so stick with me. So what is gatekeeping? As the other YouTuber said, it's had different meanings at different times, but meanings change with time. What I would say in response to that is that usages change, but original meanings remain important because, of course, it took somebody pioneering and creative as a thinker to coin a word and outline its original meaning and apply it. So we have to sort of, you know, show some fealty to that, because without people being pioneers and, you know, original thinkers and having these eureka moments, where would we be? You know, we rely on these creative people. So maybe we should give some respect to the people who were sharp enough to first come up with the concepts and terms, and maybe show some fealty to these terms, because the old argument, language changes, yes, we know that, and it is a well-worn argument and it's always trotted out, and it is true. But at the same time, not all changes are for the better. I think we'd agree with that in different sort of contexts. So anyway, what this other YouTuber said was that currently a gatekeeper is somebody who loves and is maybe quite knowledgeable about their particular passion. Let's say it's a literary genre like SF. And that these people, gatekeepers, sort of seek to protect their interest by raising artificial barriers, and I'm quoting directly here, to preserve that genre. And, you know, and arguably this could appear to exclude new faces from entering the arena of that particular fandom. Now, sociologists who have specialised in academic studies of fandoms and subcultures call them taste publics. So I'm going to use that phrase. I think it's very useful, taste publics. And they'll often link their sort of discussions of taste publics, fandoms, subcultures, to the truth that these people are consumers. They're consumers of products, of capitalism, and it's all inescapable. Because I think the writer Mark Fisher, who's really interesting, said that it was easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And I've talked about that in other videos. And you think about it, it's like a science fiction idea. We can imagine the end of the world from all sorts of angles. And I've just read a book about that subject by Adam Roberts, the science fiction writer, which is very interesting and great fun. But, you know, can we imagine the end of capitalism? You don't get many science fiction writers who even tackle that. So if we look at books, music, films, comics, the process of making art or entertainment and the selling of it to us, that's called cultural production. So it's a term applicable to all the arts. So, you know, if you were going to say the man in the street or the woman in the street or the whatever on the bus, we're going to say, wow, everything's crap these days. An academic would say cultural production has really stagnated. So somebody else who's also well worth reading on this subject of where we are in culture and why things are retro a lot of the time, what's really new, aside from Mark Fisher, is a guy called Simon Reynolds, who is a great writer, really interesting. And there's a YouTube video of him giving a lecture in Russia about his book, Retromania, which is about music, but it's applicable to sort of everything else. All the arts have gone through this. So according to my honourable friend, a gatekeeper in this definition is someone who seeks to preserve and curate a genre or formal field at a certain moment in time. This is very much part of his thesis, by excluding newbies who don't know the rules of the game. And these sort of games may appear to have been arbitrarily imposed on the taste public, the fandom in question. So these new arrivals could feel alienated and put off by gatekeepers, which can lead them to ignore those people, which they're free to do, or to turn away from that fandom, which would be a shame. And I think that's really what the particular YouTuber was getting at, and I completely agree. Now, of course, most sort of fields of cultural production can be consumed in solitary. You read on your own, but of course it's great to discuss books and your passions with other people, because you might learn something from them, and it takes you both further, So I'm going to address the idea that gatekeepers cause genres to stagnate later in this video, because my sort of sparring partner here very much felt that if gatekeepers had their own way too much, the things would stagnate, and genres can't afford to stagnate. And he's got a very, very good point. So if I talk about myself, I might be accused of say I insist that the preferred term for science fiction is SF as opposed to sci-fi. Now, since SF was for many, many decades predominantly the label used by professionals working in and around the field, writers, editors, publishers, collectors, etc., conversely, sci-fi has long been considered by those people, and I'm one of them, to be a flippant, dismissive, pejorative term that is nonetheless a more popular term these days, and it has been for decades. Somebody pointed out in the comments of one of my videos that they remember days when science fiction was a ghetto and there weren't many people in it, and it was a much smaller thing, particularly until the late 70s, and I was in my sort of early teens or late 70s. And very much, it was regarded as a very juvenile thing, that it wasn't serious. And of course, science fiction is a massive thing. There's some very serious stuff. There's some total escapism, and there's loads of other things in between. It's the very richness of it, which is what I love about it so much, and what people increasingly return to it for, because it has the essence of great fiction. I'm going to veer off here. The word novel derives from novelty. So, the purest sort of novel you get these days is a science fiction novel, because science fiction novels depend on novelty, on the novum, the new thing. And I've used that on my channel. And people who watch me all the time will be familiar with this terminology, because I've used it a lot. So if we look at, sci-fi and SF, when I made the video, at the beginning, there's a quotation from the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, which is now a website. It was a book in its original incarnation. There's 2 editions, and now a website. It's brilliant. Do look at it. I use it all the time, and I have done for decades. And it explains that some of the key figures, the professionals in the field, writers and editors, interpreted sci-fi as being a descriptor for the lowest common denominator science fiction out there, the entry-level stuff, as opposed to more sophisticated material. So, for example, Star Wars, which is accessible and has a universal appeal, and is great fun and looks great, and we all love it, is sci-fi, while the experimental, difficult work of a writer like J.G. Ballard would be SF. So this is a commonly held distinction in SF science fiction circles, and it has been since the 60s. One means low grade mass media, what have you. The other means more highfalutin stuff. So when I made the video in question, I was sort of pointing out how the difference in usages applied to different groups within the taste public of SF, professional stroke expert versus the more casual fan. I'll also agree with the point of view that it's arguably a generational thing, with sci-fi now being used more widely, but I'd also say it's equally an indicator of how people discover the genre, and we pretty much all discover it through the more accessible sort of forms of mass media, TV, films, whatever, before we ever read an SF book. I know I came into it this way. I mean, I watched my first science fiction on TV before I could read in the early 60s. My parents told me what I watched. I used to watch a show called Adam Adamant about an Edwardian guy who was frozen, and then he's comes out of deep freeze in the sort of mid-60s, and he has to cope with, you know, swinging London and miniskirts and stuff. And I have no memory of it. I've seen an episode since, and it did nothing to me, but apparently I loved it. And I would have been about 3, so that's before I could even read. So the term SF, what that usage of that generally shows how deeply a person has looked into the genre, how they've researched it and become obsessed with it. And, you know, it's a funny thing. This reference sources now, it's very easy, you know, to use the internet and what have you. And if you dig, you know, you'll find that this is the case. You know, there's a lot of information out there. But look into this yourselves and you'll see all sorts of opinions, but you will see that's the thing. So gatekeepers. So who are the gatekeepers? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I'm a gatekeeper. I've written 3 books on genre fiction, published by J.K. Rowling's publisher, Bloomsbury, in the A&C Black imprint. There's a poster for one of them up there. It's called 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, still in print. I've had essays and short fiction in the genre published. I've guest lectured at several universities on science fiction and other things. I've appeared on local and national radio talking about H.G. Wells, Blade Runner, J.G. Ballard, and I've earned a small amount of money, I wish it was more, and a little acclaim from other writers from, you know, the genre. So I'm a kind of minor professional in the SF field. If I was a full-blown one, you know, I probably wouldn't be doing this. You know, it's very hard to make money as a writer. So I've got a day job as well. So if you take those things into consideration, I can be considered an insider, a gatekeeper. Okay, so now I've got a YouTube channel, obviously, because you're watching it. About 80% of it is about SF. I'm interested in lots of other things, but people love SF and it's booming. So I've gone increasingly that way because, you know, I want it to be a success and I'm having great fun doing it. So why would I want to exclude new viewers by having an elitist attitude? It doesn't make any sense. Instead, what I really want to do, and what I've done throughout my 40-year career in my day job, which is I'm a bookseller, and, you know, is really to sort of open the gates and say, come on in, it's great in here. I can help show you the bits that I think you'll enjoy the most. One thing I've learned in my time as a bookseller is that taste is subjective. There's no accounting for it, and every taste is valid. I mean, after all, you know, you should read what you enjoy. It doesn't really matter what critics or anybody else thinks. If you like a thing, you like it. That's the truth, as the song says. But, you know, I've learned from other booksellers, from writers, from publishers and my customers, there are things I don't know about that I would love. So the process of recommendation and encouragement goes both ways across the divide. The difference with a professional, though, is that they recommend, suggest and encourage for a living. And, you know, because they sort of focused on this as a life path so often, a gatekeeper like this will know more than a non-professional and can take a newbie or even an experienced fan into new areas that they love. So, you know, I do get the idea that there are people out there who want it to be an exclusive club. You know, that's fair enough, and, you know, that does come up. But, you know, I don't think that's me, to be honest. So, you know, somebody like me wouldn't last decades in my day job as an advisor of a taste public or different taste publics if, you know, I couldn't acknowledge that taste is subjective. And, you know, you need to learn to read what someone likes and then select an alternative for them, which that'll suit their taste, but also take them into exciting new areas. And that's sort of pretty much always been my job. If you take crime fiction, for example, and the Booktuber who inspired this video with his video does a lot of crime, and he's very well read now, actually, and it's been quite nice to see him, because he's a bit younger than me, not that much younger, but he is younger than me, and he's picked up on things which I read a long time ago, and he, you know, he's got good taste, I have to say. So that to me, to you, he might have a different one, but I've read a lot of crime fiction, particularly American and European work, and for some years recently in my job, I ran an international crime reading group. The idea of this was to help crime readers find new authors that they hadn't encountered. It was quite a success, and something that I learned from one of the ladies attending the reading group was about Chinese crime fiction, which she knew loads about. She presented me a list and I knew nothing about it. And that was fascinating because Chinese crime fiction is still a tiny sort of thing in translation. Maybe it'll happen. Japanese crime fiction is coming through, but we shall see. And we did a bit of that and it was great. So, you know, around 2012, to expand on this, I'd seen a TV programme featuring a guy called Barry Forshaw, and Barry is Britain's top crime fiction critic. He used to be a bookseller as well, and he does DVD commentaries of science fiction films. And this program is about Italian crime fiction. Excuse me. So what I found was this program was great, and most book programs cover things I already know about because I've worked in the trade for years and what have you, but it was really, really great. And I jotted down names of all the authors who were covered. There were about 6 of them, and the next day I went to work, went to the crime shops, and I found we had books by all of them, and we only had about 1 for each. So I grabbed them all up and I thought, I'm going to read all these because this was great, because I do love Italy anyway, and I'd read some Italian fiction, not these people. And there was one book by a writer called Gianrico Carafilio, who was not mentioned in the show, and he's really, really famous in Italy. He's an obscure figure over here. So I bought all the books, read them all. They were all different, and that's what was great about them. They didn't follow formulas. One was really tough, another was light and shade, another was soft. They were fantastic, and they really reflected Italian culture. Really great stuff. And superb examples of crime fiction. So Barry Forsyth, arguably a gatekeeper, he let me in. A few years later, I got him along to the crime reading group, and we've been friends ever since, and he's a really great guy. So do check out Barry's stuff. He really, really knows it. Charming, charming man. So what I did then was, when I was speaking to people wanting crime fiction, I'd often say, have you tried any of the Italians? And every time, and I mean every time, this still happens, I'm still doing it without fail, because if something succeeds, you repeat the experiment, you do it again. They would say, oh, Inspector Montalbano, the Andrea Camilleri things. Now, because most British crime readers tend to prefer light and shade, I would just suggest Carafilio, because he was really, really good at light and shade, great writer, and there is a video on my channel about him. And I'd say Carafilio as opposed to somebody super hard-boiled like Massimo Carlotto, who I really revere as well. You know, if I was talking to somebody, I'd say, what do you like? And, you know, if they seem to have a really noiry, hardcore edge, I would say, oh, you know, give it Carlotto. So within a year, we were selling more books by Gianrico Carafilio in our city than anywhere else in the UK except London. The city I live in has a population of 100,000 people. London, of course, is a couple of million, isn't it? So you know, it was a big, big thing. The publishers are very pleased. They're a small publisher, Bitter Lemon Press. And eventually, I was able to invite Carafilio to our shop to make his first provincial UK appearance, and 45 people turned up. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but for a small press writer who's unknown in the UK, that's quite something, and people loved his work. Sadly, the event was cancelled at the 11th hour, because that day he was flying over from Ireland, where he'd been doing an event, and there was that terrible storm a few years ago where people were actually killed, and the plane couldn't take off. So I had to turn people away at the door, which was terrible. But we'd sold hundreds of the books, and we have done since. So when someone might appear to be a gatekeeper, saying, you know, this is really good, you should give this a try, what they're really trying to do, more often than not, is usher you in to join them, because they love their genre, as my honourable friend pointed out, and they want you involved. It's not about you can't be a true fan of Scandi crime if you haven't read Schwal and Walu's Martin Beck series. It's more like, you like Scandi, you've got to read the Martin Beck books. They started it all, and they're brilliant. That's more what it's about. People want you to share, and you know, and if you don't agree, you don't agree. That's okay. You know, we've got to be big enough for that. So if the gatekeeper suggests something that doesn't hit the mark, maybe it'll work next time. If these people, like me, are gatekeepers, well, you need to get used to it, because they're here to stay. Think about it. These older people often know their stuff, and they're usually willing to learn about more, in my experience. But to give them their due, they've developed sound judgment over what they like. And very often they know probably what other people might like as well. As somebody said in the comments on the video which inspired this video, we have an academic system based on acknowledgement of expertise. Perhaps academics started as fans too. They probably still are, otherwise they wouldn't be doing their jobs. So where does gatekeeping start? There's lots of gatekeepers involved in books. Have a think about it. Maybe it starts with writers who feel that they have to follow their hearts and write books with difficult prose styles or disturbing subject matter, as opposed to being bland and trying to please everyone, which is a sure way to fail. Divisiveness is part of life. You can't please everybody. Sometimes you'll inadvertently offend. You know, it's just a matter of taste. You like one YouTuber, you don't like another. You know, it's not often what they say, it's often how they say it. It is what it is. Other gatekeepers, there are the publishers who won't publish that writer's work because it's too difficult, and they make sure that writer stays outside the gates of publication. Then there's the editors who decide to work with the writer to alter, amend and revise their text, their prose, so it'll work for an audience that the editor either knows is there or suspect might be there. Maybe there's something new here, and maybe there's a latent audience that none of us know exists yet, and those are the best sort of editors. If you look in novels, you'll often see glowing things about acknowledgements, and you think, does this writer really need to sort of acknowledge all these people? The answer is probably yes. And if you talk to writers, and I've talked to probably hundreds over the years, it's amazing how much they rely on these other gatekeepers of their own work. So what else is there? There's reviewers and critics who damn the book when it appears, ensuring that the people who really sort of follow reviews, in my view, slavishly, who won't think for themselves, who don't know what to go for, will feel, well, maybe I'd have to try that if that critic says it's no good, because they acknowledge that critic knows something they don't. Perhaps they don't. Perhaps they're just trying to hit a deadline. Perhaps they're copying other critics. There's a lot of that, I can tell you now. Even worse, they don't review it at all. So it never gets the oxygen of publicity to catch a light so that people can see the flame of that book and think, what is that light? I'm going to pick it up. It's illuminating me. So that doesn't happen. So, then there's a new phenomena, the very worst gatekeepers, the ones we really, really should be concerned about. Sensitivity readers who, like the employees at the Ministry of Truth in Orwell's 1984, want to rewrite our favourite writers. They want to rewrite Dahl. They want to rewrite Fleming. Will your favourite writer be next, even if they're uncontroversial? Now that's the worst kind of gatekeeping, isn't it, really? Then, of course, there's the bookshops who decide not to stock the book. There's 100,000 new books published in Britain every year. It's a huge amount. You have to be selective. I bought books in my day job for 27 years. New books, backlists, what have you. Most bookshops now, it's more central. There was a time when I went in bookshops when everybody worked in the shop would do some buying. Even now, I'll say to buyers whose job is just to buy, and I've done this myself. I once had a job where I was to buy for 6 different bookshops in one chain. I'd say, we could really do with this because this is great. We'll make a thing of it. And sometimes they'll say, we don't get a lot of sort of margin from the publisher. We won't make a lot of money on that. We could go this instead, what have you. So, there are gatekeepers everywhere. And, we have to think about this. It's the real thing. It's a business world as well as an aesthetic one. So, and then there's the bookshops who will stock the book and they'll recommend it with all their hearts to readers who they feel are right for that particular work. And this is a great thing because, the beauty of working in the book trade is you'll often see things people don't see and you're sort of super exposed to it, kid in a sweet shop thing. And, you'll discover somebody and you're great and you'll think this guy's great or this woman's book is amazing. And you'll recommend it and grow it a bit, and then you'll go to another bookshop 100 miles ago and you'll see that somebody else has picked up on it, and you too, it's like spooky action at a distance. The particles are joined, and it's a great feeling when you see that. And gradually, sometimes these people take off. Sadly, some of the great stuff doesn't. It is one of those things. It's an unfortunate thing, and that's what a lot of my channel is about, putting those things out there and saying, guys, yeah, there's all this obvious stuff, but there's other stuff as well. So if I hadn't learned through long experience how to read a taste public, how to read a fandom or a subculture, and to suggest things they love, any bookshop I ran would, close down for lack of sales, and that hasn't happened yet. Some gates are for some people, there's other gates for others. With some readers, every single gate works for them. They're lucky people, they've got broad Catholic tastes, and that's a great way to be. So, it's a question of everybody's a gatekeeper in a way. It's just selecting the right gate to bring people through, and that judgment comes with time. So it's the same for writers, publishers, editors, critics, all the gatekeepers. They have to perform both in a business and aesthetic sense, and aren't social media influencers gatekeepers by default too? Think about that. Everybody's got their own taste. We're out there, me, whoever, saying we're telling you what's good or what's bad or what we personally like or don't like, the subjective measure. But without some distaste alongside the taste, there would be no flavour to the food we're offering each other to try, would there? And where would be the fun in that? So, that's why it's called cultural production. it's like a Marxist term. But instead of the workers owning the means of production, what you could say is that an elite cadre of gatekeepers owns it. Writers, editors, publishers, booksellers, what have you. But if they get it wrong, they use their livelihood. So, they're going to try hard to please as many different taste publics as they can, from the highbrow specialist reader to the light casual escapist, to the expert, to the novice. They're all equally valuable in the long run. And of course, now we have things like TikTok, which has been brilliant for the book trade. I mean, it's brought in a huge amount of money. Some people are very critical of it. I've never watched a single I've never watched a single book talk book video in my life, because I work in books all the time. I'm surrounded by it. I see the results. I get to know what comes up, because the trade talks about little else these days. It's been an enormous boom for sales. But what is interesting is that it only seems really to influence a certain age group and a certain gender demographic. It does a little bit outside that, but generally it's in one area, and that's quite interesting. So that's one way that people are coming up and sort of circumventing gatekeepers like me. So, good for them. Great. It's nice to see that happening. The more books sell, the happier we are. But what would you do if you owned the means of production? Because, of course, there is that alternative, like TikTok. Just as publishers and booksellers were often the same thing a century or two ago. You would sort of go in and a bookshop would have a press at the back, and they'd sort of print stuff. You can self-publish. I mean, self-publishing's always been there. Vanity publishing is what we used to call it. You can self-publish your ebook on Amazon, and you can have it as print on demand. And these are easier options because the tech is there. This started to become a thing about 15 years ago, and everybody's really worried about it. We were worried about the Kindle, and those of us who worked in bookshops. And after a while, people, a lot of people generally went back to the physical book, and I'll talk about that another time. Because a book has a soul. So, I mean, the books I've got here have got souls, and I'll tell you about them and I'll come to them. There are going to be some books in this, thankfully. I'll be pleased to hear. So, really, if you want to get it out there now, and, I'm the laziest writer on earth. I'm too busy YouTubing to write. I've got a few things in anthologies and stuff, which, I could probably get them bound together. So maybe I'll do it. But, I don't know. I actually like the idea of somebody gatekeeping me to keep my standards high. But I'll get around to it at some point. So, but most self-published books, this is the real point I'm coming to, is they fail. They fail aesthetically and commercially because they haven't been gate kept. Nobody is watching. They can be badly written and edited, poorly packaged, get no publicity. Whereas if they've been curated by these gatekeepers, they may well have succeeded. I was sent a novel a while ago, and I usually, whenever somebody contacts me and says, can I send you my self-published book, I say no. And that may appear closed-minded, but that's because I know from long experience that most of them haven't gone through that process. And the one time I said yes, since I started doing Booktube, I was sent a novel, and in the very first sentence there was a tautology. There was two different words meaning the same thing used, and any decent editor would have excised one straight away. Shortened the sentence, tighter, been much, much better. It would have been better written by almost any standard you can name. But of course, there are exceptions. I mean, if you take, for example, they're rare. They're so uncommon that the exceptions prove the rule. Self-published books don't work rule. Let's have an exception. Andy Weir's The Martian, hugely popular book, originally self-published on his website. He'd written other things, he'd written comics, what have you. That's a rule-making exception. Few people who write their own SF or any other kind of novel will get anywhere. As to the future, who knows? So a number of prominent SF writers have said, and some have said to me, The Martian isn't a great SF book. Personally, I think it's a typical Robinsonade. Now, a Robinsonade is a term from SF criticism for science fiction novels which mirror the basic plot of Robinson Crusoe. I mean, there's a 1950s SF film called Robinson Crusoe on Mars. It's not a new idea. And of course, because Robinson Crusoe is a travel narrative based on a true story, that's a huge influence over SF. I mean, Jules Verne used to call his things voyages extraordinaires, extraordinary voyages. So Robinsonades have existed in SF for a very long time. You can look it up in the SF Encyclopedia. So, it's fine as an entry-level text. But if you want to advance in your SF reading, I mean, I'd sort of recommend you try Shipwreck by Charles Logan, which won the Gollancz Sunday Times Award Awards joint winner back in 1975, and this was due to become a Gollancz masterwork. They probably done it as a gateway, and it did have a paperback. I don't think he ever wrote anything else, and this is one heck of a Robsonade, so seek that out. So that's the sort of thing that this Gatekeeper will lead you to. It'll upset your expectations, it turn things on your head, and it's something that all good SF writers are brilliant at. There's something at the core of the genre is about the shock and the unexpected and the new paradigm, the new idea. Bang, fantastic stuff. So watch out for that. Try and get one. It's really good. There are paperbacks out there second hand, and hopefully it will get reissued because it's great stuff. So, you know, you have that thing where there are sort of entry level things which occasionally break through in self-publishing. So while we're also on this, digressing again, my honourable friend, as I keep calling him, he recently did a video or two about Samuel R. Delany's controversial novel Hog. Now, Hog was gate-kept for decades because it was considered too shocking to publish, and it went through revisions and what have you. And my take on explaining why Delany wrote Hog, because the commentator I'm referring to, you know, was saying he was trying to work out why somebody would write this book. My answer was two words, which is Michel Foucault, the French philosopher. If you read up on Foucault and his work, you'll understand why Delany wrote Hog. So there's going to be a video coming up here about Delany's extreme works, his other ones besides Hog, because a lot of people are reading it these days and it's kind of covered, and I don't have a copy at the moment. It's quite hard to get currently, but I'll be talking about that as well. So let's try and sum up the argument about gatekeeping before we move on to another couple of things. There's a famous quotation by the Roman poet Juvenal, who lived, I think, in the 2nd century, and in a work called the 16 Satires, he said, "Who watches the watchmen? Who watches the watchmen?" This phrase is where Alan Moore's comic series Watchmen derives its name from. A really famous quote, and it's applied in political things and all sorts of things. And it's a good question. If we've got Watchmen, I mean, if you take Watchmen, vigilante superheroes, they're a law unto themselves. Maybe they need to be managed, and that's the plot, isn't it? Or is it the cops who are failing to control crime who need watching by the superheroes, you know? If things are letting the public down, where do we go? So who watches the watchmen? You know, so watchmen, gatekeepers, very similar. So I think really my Booktube friends' argument can be countered with my view, which is who watches the watchmen, who are watching the watchmen. Take it back another level. Okay, so it is a constant sort of flow between people of making judgment, you know. So, you know, as soon as we pass judgment of any kind, we include or we exclude. That's part of argument. You can't do it in any other way. Because as soon as somebody says, oh, you know, this is for everybody, someone will say, no, it isn't, because it's like that scene in the Monty Python film, Life of Brian, where Brian is being pursued by the mob who think he's the Messiah. And he says, look, you're all individuals. And en masse, they say, yes, we're all individuals. And one guy says, I'm not. So, you know, that's sort of classic stuff. So really, as soon as somebody says you're being judgmental, they're being judgmental too. It's one of the semantic paradoxes of language, of life, of reality. If you can't be just, be arbitrary, as they say. So something that my honourable friend says, he says that most gatekeepers are, and I'll quote him here, older people, which inevitably leads to stagnation. Older people, which inevitably leads to stagnation. Well, you could say that's an ageist view, a stereotypical casting of mature people as being set in their ways. You know, you could equally say young people lack knowledge. That's another cliche. That's another stereotype. Both cliches, both stereotypes. Now, the thing is those things do ring true to us as averages, because observationally we see some truth in this in our own experience. But of course, there's always exceptions to any stereotype. Not everybody old is a stick in the mud. Not everybody young is, you know, lacking in wisdom. You know, there's some people out there, you know, I know lots of people who sort of better read than me when they were kids. And, you know, I think, how do they do that? You know, so there you go. So what I would say is that, you know, this idea that gatekeepers are all older people who are simply victims of nostalgia for when they were younger and fitter and better looking, and when their preferences were more suited to the zeitgeist at that time in their youth. It's a very tired, worn out argument. It's worn out by overuse, and it's a knee-jerk reaction posture. While it can be true, it can also be false. Yeah, there's some truth in it, but, you know, there's always exceptions to the rule. So what I would say is that gatekeepers can often identify moments, whether then or now, and in the future when that comes, which new arrivals in a taste public could come to love. It's all about how they do it, which comes down to judging taste. And this takes expertise. Take, for example, The Three Body Problem. You know, it's a huge smash, successful book, but it doesn't mean everybody will like it. You know, it's one of those things. If you take the very wonderful Matt at Booktuber, my favourite Booktuber, for example, he generally doesn't get on with much contemporary SF much of the time. He doesn't think it's very good, with the odd exception. And I'm the same. I don't think there's a lot going on in SF at the moment. But Matt's 25 years younger than me. You know, he's been actively reading. Let's say he became a big reader when he was 10. That means he's been reading for 25 years. If I became a big reader when I was 10, I've been for 50. So we come to the similar conclusions, and we have very similar tastes, it has to be said. So, you know, it's more about taste than nostalgia. It's more about self-education, history and context. So on my channel, I don't really aim for entry level because, people already do that. You know, I aim for people who are already reasonably well read in SF, and that's intentional. There's lots of people doing great for beginners videos, and good luck to them, you know. So I do the more advanced stuff. I do context, history and theory in SF, hence my sort of comments on terminology and the way it sort of goes. So, you know, when you think someone's gatekeeping, remember that writers, publishers, editors, critics, booksellers, they all gatekeep, you know. So do readers by saying this is good, that's bad. No one's innocent. So it's a complex argument, you know, and the philosopher Hegel said that the dialogue in argument starts with a thesis, which my booktube friend presented a thesis about what he feels about gatekeepers and gatekeeping, and then it's met by antithesis, which is my retort here, antithesis, antithesis. So here's my sort of thing, and in the debate those two things merge and we have a synthesis. Thesis, antithesis equals synthesis. The ideas merge and they become accommodating or not. Then the process starts again. So you've got a new synthesis, which is presented as a thesis, then you get a new antithesis, and it goes on. So when you argue, unless you just gainsaying, if you're saying yes it is, no it isn't, you're gatekeeping. It doesn't matter, you know, if it's a popular view or not. It's just part of the things. If you want to read a brilliant Hegelian SF novel, and I did review this a while ago, This by Adam Roberts, this is really quite something. The beginning section might take your head off, but absolutely brilliant. And me and Adam are supposed to be chatting on the channel soon, but we've sort of got out of sync with each other. Hopefully it'll ham, but I'm slightly scared about that because he's got such a big brain, you know, but it's great stuff. So this is out in paperback now. Give it a try. It's marvellous. So moving on from gatekeeping, just to talk about fandom, and before we talk about stagnation, it's worth noting that the word fan really originates in culture production from the science fiction field in the 1930s. Science fiction as a label was only coined in 1926 when Hugo Gernsback started his magazine in 1925. He called it scientifiction. Now you try and say that when you've had a feel, or even before you've had one at all. I've got to practice to say it every time, and I've known it for decades. Scientifiction. And a fan wrote in and said, why not call it science fiction? Rolls off the tongue better. I actually don't know when SF became a thing. I should really look into this. I'm supposed to know this stuff. So, you know, so even though science fiction had been around as an emergent genre for centuries, you know, the term sort of came up then. The word fan was used immediately, you know, in SF circles, and it derives from fanatic or from feign, an archaic word which relates to temples or places of worship. And that's what we do as fans. We worship, you know, our idols, the books, you know, the films, whatever we like. And a variation was fancy. You know, the word fancy was used by sports fans in the States as far back as the 1880s. So it goes from there. The term fanzine, a fan-produced magazine, definitely originated in SF fandom in the 1930s. Science fiction fans were in a minority then, especially the ones who wanted more than simple escapism. Because they curated and gatekept the genre, many of them did so by becoming writers, editors, publishers, agents. If you take John W. Campbell Jr., who wrote a story he was a fan, you know, most of these guys in those magazines were fans to begin with. Frederick Paul, you know, there's a great book called How the Future Was by Fred Paul, which is out of print. You can get it secondhand fairly easily. And he tells you what he was like in the early days of SF fandom. It's a great read. John W. Campbell, who was a fan, he wrote a story in 1937 called Who Goes There, which was filmed twice as The Thing. Well, it's been filmed 3 times as The Thing. So if you like The Thing, and you probably like the John Carpenter version, like me, from 1982, I think that was written in 1937, decades before, you know? And the thing with Campbell was that he wanted really good writing, and he wanted really interesting science concepts, you know. So he was a gatekeeper. The magazine he edited, Astounding, which later became Analog, you know, was better than all the others. He insisted on that. And when you had editors in other magazines who were non-fans, they just took, you know, stories which you had hack writers writing Western templates, and all they did was supplant the tropes. So the horses became starships, and the 6-shooters became zap guns, and the Native Americans became aliens. You know, it was that sort of thing. Interesting metaphor there, of course. So, you know, he really raised the bar. Now, the interesting thing about the history of SF, and in terms of stagnation, was that it was a genre that thrived on evolution and revolution. I've always said evolution, and I was talking to my friend Jim Goddard about this, who runs Leaky Boot Press, and he said, no, it's not evolution, Steve, it's revolution. I thought, yeah, he's right. But, you know, you evolve through revolting, if you'll pardon the expression. So the gatekeepers, they welcome newbies in, and these newbies learned about the genre from the gatekeepers, and then they created their own fresh take on it. And, you know, you have the golden age, which lasted from 1939 to the late 40s, the Campbell era. And then, you know, new magazine editors came in after the war, and they sort of, you know, they thought, well, you know, this is all very well and good, you know. And by that point, Campbell was pretty much fixated on psi-powers. You had to write about psi-powers to get anything published by him then. And he's an interesting figure. And, you know, the new sort of guy said, well, we want to write social satire. We want to write about what's happening in America, you know, McCarthyism, because it was in the UK as well. So, you know, social satire became the thing. The works of Robert Sheckley, Philip K. Dick, Kurt Vonnegut. So there was still something for everything, because the old stuff was still there. You know, there were lots of markets read. Then in the 1960s, you had the new wave. This is where experimental modernist techniques were brought into SF from realistic fiction by young Turks who wanted to improve the literary quality and to bring a stunning new evolution, a new revolution to SF. And that really sort of shook things up. A lot of the old guys didn't like the new wave, you know, but eventually everybody got on okay, with a few exceptions. You know, there was a lot of hating of Robert Heinlein going on. So you had 3 revolutions in as many decades. Now, I'm a new waver. I'm very much a new wave guy, but it was over by the time I was old enough to read adult SF. You know, I found it so fantastic. I've always tried to edge people towards new wave, but I guess that's gatekeeping. Doesn't mean I dislike other SF, it's just I have a preference. And in the, you know, the late 70s, new wave consolidated with more traditional forms. I think it did stagnate a bit then for that reason. So you're stylistic and historical and contextual. And then in the early 80s, cyberpunk took off. And I saw William Gibson give a speech in 1987, by which point he was well established. And he was attacking the complacency of my beloved new wave. But, you know, Gibson was great. He really brought something new to SF, and I love his work. He's one of only, I think there's only 4 writers I buy their books automatically without even thinking about it, and Gibson's one of them. The other 2 are all new wave guys. So, you know, then you had the renaissance of space opera, and that to me was stagnation, with a few exceptions of people who wrote it really brilliantly. It was back to the old 1930s golden age tropes, and they were worn thin with overuse. So it's not all gatekeepers and curators who have stagnated science fiction as a genre. If anything, it's the conservatives and traditionalists who, having seen science fiction on screens that was far less sophisticated than, say, the new wave stuff, which had taken things forward. So it wasn't essentially an elite that caused SF to stagnate. It was arguably an influx of newcomers. So say, you know, Star Wars was your first thing. And I used to work with a guy who lives in the States now, and we were great friends. And he was getting into SF when we started working together. So I was kind of his curator, gatekeeper. And he told me when as a child, he went through a period of watching Star Wars every day on a VHS, on a video cassette. Now, I can't imagine what that would do to your consciousness. You know, by the time video recorders were available and affordable, I was 21 and I was working, so I could buy one. Before that, you couldn't get to see this stuff. Now it's easy to see almost anything unless it's been withdrawn, and it's probably online somewhere for free. So, so it was arguably, the people who came and who liked Star Wars, maybe they dragged things backward. It's that thing. So there's all sorts of people involved in this. So arguably an influx of newcomers wanted to maybe revive escapism and reduce experimentation. Maybe it was the guys who thought, well, I can't actually experiment anymore. I'm running out of ideas. We've got to go back to the trad stuff. The point is that there's room in SF and in other genres for everybody. Except there isn't. What I've seen in my time in the book trade as a seller and writer is change. There's nothing I can do about it. All I can do is advise on the basis of taste and tailoring what I do to each particular taste I perceive. In 1977, Star Wars appeared, and even though it was a nostalgic homage to the 1930s pulp cinema series like Flash Gordon, it wasn't intended to be anything else. It wasn't intended to be cutting edge, except in the quality of the special effects and the visuals. It was a look back at escapism. The fact that it was state of the art in terms of the special effects, this convinced people that this is where science fiction was at in 1977. It's not. It's not where science fiction writing was at. Okay, so we went from 2001, if we just talk about cinema, The Man Who Fell to Earth and The Final Program, or late 60s, early 70s films, and we went back to the pre-war era. All those things are based on books, of course. Star Wars is only tangentially based on books because it borrows from all sorts of pop sources. Also in 77, Del Rey started pushing writers to copy Tolkien's 3-book structure. Terry Brooks was the sort of guy with that, really. And because the majority of people struggle to define the difference between SF and fantasy, other than listing tropes, and a list of tropes does not make a genre make, those two genres have always been lumped in together by publishers. And there was a time when a lot of SF writers wrote fantasy and vice versa. Now very few do that. Most fantasy writers now probably couldn't write SF, is the truth of it. The result has been on year on year since then, more publishing money goes to fantasy than SF. So there's a budgetary gatekeeping at publishers that affects cultural production. So while the money goes to fantasy, it drains away from SF. So instead of seeing it as a distinct market, they see it as one market and it drains away. Fantasy is mostly simpler than SF in its popular forms like sword and sorcery and high fantasy. So it does tend to sell more to those people who want just escapism, and that's the majority taste public. That's absolutely fine. Keeps me in a job. So SF stagnated because of new writers and new younger audiences rather than because of old gatekeepers like me. That's my argument. It actually goes backward in sophistication. It gets worse rather than better. Okay, so maybe I'm being an old gatekeeper on this and saying, oh no, young people, they've got no idea, blah, blah, blah. But, I'll tell you what, read a lot more SF and come back to me and tell me what you think in a year's time. Read a load of masterworks and see what you think. But again, it's all down to taste. So quality will out, Loads of classic SF from decades ago still sells, still in print, and is still read by neophytes. That's because so much of that stuff is evolutionary, revolutionary, and it's still fresh despite being old. I think there's less fresh stuff around now. But the real reason why genres stagnate, of course, and once you've read a lot, you realise there's very little new under the sun in any field of cultural production, is an historical reason. We live in the postmodern age since the late 1980s because, first of all, because of video, then home computers and the internet, we can access almost all the culture in the world if we can find to study and enjoy it. People couldn't do that before. Just think about it. Go back a couple of centuries, even the richest people in the world who could travel, they couldn't see all the art, hear all the music. They couldn't see all the art because they couldn't visit everywhere and there weren't any photographs. They couldn't hear all the music because there was no recording until about 125 years ago. But so those of us who grew up from the birth of the modern world at the beginning of the 20th century were exposed to novelty, to new things all their life, and we had it rushing at us. And we saw things like science fiction going through revolutions. We saw rock and roll music going through revolutions, going from being mere pop to rock and roll to rock music, psychedelia, punk, reggae, what have you. All these things happened. Then it all slowed down. Because the trouble is now is we've all caught up. The question now is, can the young and the inspired, no matter what the inspired are, whatever age they are, can they bring us something new, or will they just revive things which are new to them or old hat to us. So let's hope so. So that's my take on that. For more thoughts on where SF was, how it's been affected by the mass media, how it's been affected by technology, modernism and postmodernism, you can stick with this Gatekeeper. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. See you again soon. Bye for now.